this presentation, we will review the Ontario Ministry of Education's Policy Program Memorandum, or PPM, number 8, Identification of and Program Planning for Students with Learning Disabilities. Supporting our most vulnerable students is a key priority of the Ministry, as well as the School Board, and understanding policy requirements will assist in implementing appropriate system-wide processes and procedures to ensure that the needs of students with learning disabilities are met. The PPM outlines direction along 4 main foci. First, to outline a definition for the term learning disability in order to better understand what a learning disability is. 2, to outline criteria for the recognition and identification of a learning disability in order to appropriately differentiate learning disabilities from other diagnoses. 3, to provide direction on early, ongoing screening and assessment. In particular, when to keep an eye out and the criteria for how a child is assessed with a learning disability. 4, to outline program planning ideas for children with learning disabilities. According to the definition provided by the Ontario Ministry of Education in this PPM, a learning disability is one of several neurodevelopmental disorders that impacts the ability of a child to learn and use academic and other skills. The child has at least average intellectual ability and thus can learn, but often has difficulty processing verbal and/or nonverbal information. That could mean verbal instruction provided by a teacher, reading of a text, or sometimes even nonverbal social cues. Critical in understanding a learning disability is dispelling untruths about what causes a learning disability. As stated earlier, a learning disability is a neurodevelopmental disorder and, as such, is not caused by other medical conditions, such as a lack of acuity in hearing and/or vision that has not been corrected, or intellectual disabilities. It is also not the result of environmental factors such as socioeconomic factors, cultural differences, or a lack of proficiency in the language of instruction. Finally, a learning disability is not due to behavior concerns such as a lack of motivation or effort, gaps in attendance, or inadequate opportunity to benefit from instruction. A learning disability often results in academic underachievement. Academic achievement often requires extremely high levels of effort to be maintained and/or requires additional support, such as the support of a special education teacher. Underachievement tends to appear in areas of reading, writing, mathematics, and work habits and learning skills. Other challenges can include difficulties in one or more cognitive processes, such as one of the following: phonological processing, memory and attention, processing speeds, perceptual motor processing, visual spatial processing, executive functions, such as self-regulation of behavior and emotions, planning, organizing of thoughts and activities, prioritizing, and decision-making. Difficulties in social interaction may also manifest. For example, difficulty in understanding social norms or the point of view of others. There is a range in severity for most students with a learning disability. To formally recognize and identify a child with a learning disability, several signs need to be present. They include language delays, difficulties in rhyming, counting, or fine motor skills, as well as behavioral manifestations. Note that not all of these signs need to be present, but any combination can be present. A key point to remember is that difficulties in learning may not be noticed until the early years of school. Given that there is a range of severity, a learning disability can become apparent at any age. As a result, school boards are required to establish policies for both early and ongoing screening, programming, and support. Ongoing monitoring is also required to ensure that students with learning disabilities are identified. Any psychoeducational or psychological assessments need to have parent consent and must be completed by a member of the College of Psychologists of Ontario. Assessments are to be culturally sensitive and based on Canadian norms. When assessing for a learning disability, multiple sources of data should be used, including information from parents, educators, students, educational and medical history, and any outside assessments. Once assessed and identified at an initial placement and review committee meeting, or IPRC, all recommendations are to be included in the child's IEP. Instruction is to personalize the learning needs of the child, as well as being precise, explicit, and intensive as required. Appropriate modifications of learning expectations are to be included, which include the use of expectations at a different grade level and/or an increase or decrease in the number and/or complexity of expectations. Instructional, environmental, or other assessment accommodations should be provided as appropriate. Alternative expectations and/or courses that are not derived from an Ontario curriculum policy document should be developed as needed. Finally, strategies used should focus on the principles of universal design for learning, as well as differentiated instruction. All IEPs need to include a transition plan, and transition planning must be considered as part of the IEP in accordance with Ontario Regulation 181/98 and Policy Program Memorandum number 156. In our school board, there are several ways in which a child who is identified can be supported. The initial steps can include modifications to the learning program in a child's individual education plan. With an IPRC placement of regular classroom with withdrawal assistance, a child can receive support by the classroom teacher via a modified program and/or via a support program developed by the special education teacher, usually in the areas of language and/or mathematics. If more intensive support is required, our school board also has a learning disabled intensive support program available. With a placement of a special education classroom with partial integration at an IPRC, the child would spend 50% of the day in a small group setting receiving intensive support for language and mathematics, and would spend the remainder of the day in an integrated classroom engaged in the other subject areas. This now concludes our presentation of Policy Program Memorandum number 8, Identification of and Program Planning for Students with Learning Disabilities. We thank you for your attention, and we hope that you now have a clear understanding of the PPM.